Jessie gender when she reviews Lower Decks. Excuse me, I'm sorry, my Federation standard's a little bit rusty. I'm saying that I'm very excited. Hello interwebs, it is time to review Star Trek Lower Decks Season 2, Episode 2, Kayshon, His Eyes Open. Yes, obviously in reference to our new security chief and our first Tamarian Starfleet officer in Star Trek. And we're going to get to all of that in my review of this episode. But as per usual, just so you all know, we're going to be doing spoiler-free thoughts up first. So if you haven't seen the episode, which, come on, get on that. But if you haven't seen it, we'll get into all the spoiler-free stuff, and then we'll get heavily into spoiler talk, but I will give a warning when we get there. Spoiler free, what did I think of this episode? Well, this episode kind of is doing what I thought episode 1 of this season was going to be, kind of having a split storytelling focus, with one story focusing on the Cerritos crew, Mariner, Tendi, Rutherford, and what's going on with them, and then another storyline going on over on the USS Titan with Boimler, and him sort of dealing with this crazy new situation that he's in over on the Titan. I really enjoyed both of these storylines for vastly different reasons. The Cerritos storyline I thought was a lot of fun, very much riffing on an old TNG type of episode, kind of thinking of the episode The Most Toys, the one where there was that guy who was collecting stuff and kidnapped Data and sort of took him for his collection. So this episode's kind of playing off of that trope, that there's a whole group of collectors collecting stuff, and the Cerritos crew has been called in to sort of help people catalog it and deal with any dangerous situations that might be in this guy's collection and stuff. Tons of Easter eggs based on that very premise. Like, there were so many Easter eggs in this episode that I could not list them all unless I wanted to be here all day. But all of that was really fun sort of setup to do kind of two things with Mariner's character, and I really found this episode to be efficient in that. Mariner clearly needs a new story arc going into season 2, because season 1, her story arc was very much coming to terms with she is someone who can take charge, she can come into command, she can be someone who actually wants to pursue a career in Starfleet and not just constantly get thrown in the brig. That was sort of like her arc in season 1, and so season 2, it's sort of setting up this sort of question of like, now that she's kind of accepted that responsibility, what does that mean for her command style? And I liked that this situation sort of dove into the different types of command that she can do, and sort of offsetting her with a character of Jet, who we knew back from season 1 of Lower Decks, and he also comes in and takes the place of sort of like a Boimler fill-in, sort of taking the place of like the button-up rule-following guy that Boimler was. But it also sort of shows how much Mariner, playing off of this character, how much Mariner has come accustomed to who Boimler is specifically, and also how much she's grown based off of like what Boimler taught her back in season 1, and how she needs to learn to follow, maybe follow the rules or change up her command style a little bit. All of that was really wonderful, and so I love this sort of mirror inversion of Boimler with the Jet, and also sort of Mariner having her own storyline. We'll get all into that in just a second. But the other side of this episode, I actually thought I wasn't going to like as much. It was Boimler on the Titan, and I was a little bit worried about how that storyline was going to go. It kind of, I thought that they were going to go a specific way with Boimler's character arc in that episode. I was like, oh, Boimler's going to be bad at his job. I won't spoil where that goes just yet, but what I will say is that where that storyline in the Titan goes, I loved. I thought was absolutely a great surprise, and didn't take the route that I actually thought they were going to take with Boimler's character to sort of get everything back to where we kind of assumed it was going to go with Boimler back on the Cerritos. And I won't, again, say if that happens this episode until we get into spoilers. But interesting stuff there. I also like that whole section on the Titan has its own kind of interesting critique of Star Trek as it evolved both within the Next Generation and in the movie era of Next Generation, but also into Discovery era that we have today. And it's not a like hating on those things, but it's sort of an interesting criticism and critique on different aspects of Star Trek and different types of Star Trek, the more action-oriented type of Star Trek. Even Deep Space Nine kind of gets tossed in this sort of criticism over here on the Titan. But I thought that was really great. It was telling a good, interesting Boimler storyline, but also marrying it with a sort of discussion and criticism of what Star Trek is. So there's a really good marrying of a meta conversation going on there. All that being said, I will say this episode just ended up being really, really strong for me, despite it being one that I, going into it, especially on the Titan side of things, I thought I wasn't going to really like as much, but ultimately subverted all my expectations and really became a true standout episode that had a lot to say, honestly, about both the characters and Star Trek as a whole, and I honestly really loved it and enjoyed it. But to discuss all of that, we're going to have to get into spoilers, so if you haven't seen the episode yet, go sign up for Paramount Plus. Come on. I know it's Paramount Plus, but I mean, like, there's other things on there besides Star Trek too. You can watch like The Good Wife. I think that's on there. I have no idea. Just just watch it. Watch the episode. Also, I just want to promote a video that I did just about a week or so ago that was about why Star Trek Lower Decks is my favorite Star Trek, and I break down everything I love about it. I also get drunk and just gush about the show at one point in the video, so that's kind of fun. But the video didn't get a ton of views, so I just wanted to share it here just because it was a video that meant a lot to me. I was very excited about making it, and I would love for you to all see it, especially for those of you who are big fans of Star Trek Lower Decks. All right, now that we're in the spoiler-filled section, let's get into describing the episode and sort of going through it beat by beat. Because this episode is sort of much more segmented, I'm going to sort of split it off into the two different storylines that we have going on here. And we'll start with the Mariner Cerritos storyline. So the first scene of the episode is the cold open, and we get Mariner sort of meeting up with Jet, and we learn that Jet is sort of going to be taking the place of Boimler in sort of the Lower Decks crew. Jet being the character that we met way back in, I think, season 1, I think episode 4, I think what Cupid's Errant Era, whatever episode that was. But he's been transferred in to sort of take Boimler's place, and we already start to get that initially this idea that Jet is kind of going to fill the same role as Boimler. He's going to be a little bit stuck up, follow the rules kind of guy. There's sort of that reference when they go into the sonic showers, which was kind of funny. It's kind of funny that the Starfleet has like communal showers, and I liked how they shot this. At least the version that I had, they sort of were all censored because of the sonic showers. You couldn't see them being naked, but I like that no one really cares that they're all naked together. It also felt very Starship Troopers-esque in that way as well, just a co-ed sort of thing. That's awesome. I'm here for sort of like co-ed showers, and it's normal. It's not a weird thing, and nakedness isn't a weird thing. Very Star Trek, very Starfleet. Enjoyed that. But I also enjoyed like Mariner and Jet sort of like facing off against each other and sort of having this ego battle that sort of sets up what's going to happen with these characters going forward, but also showing, Mariner said like, oh, Boimler would let me do this. That sort of setup of Jet being a sort of mirror Boimler, but not exactly, and sort of Mariner having certain assumptions on who Jet is based on her experiences with Boimler. All that's great. Also, I should say the sonic showers very much reminded me of the decom chamber in Star Trek Enterprise. It looked very similar, which anything that I can milk out of like, oh, it's an Enterprise reference makes me happy, even though I know it probably wasn't intentional. Felt very Enterprise. All they needed was the gel. They just need to be gelling each other up, and it would be, a perfect Enterprise reference for me. Just gel each other up. That's all I'm asking. It's the Enterprise way. Anyways, let's keep going. After the title sequence, we get to meet our new security officer replacing the sadly gone Shax from last season. Again, I like this. I'm sad that Shax was gone, but I like to see that, his loss has weight and is actually changing up the dynamics of the crew, because we meet Kayshon, who is Tamarian, I believe is how you say their species, but the Darmok the Darmok people, the people from the Speak in Metaphor, way back from Next Generation. I like that his introduction was sort of like, him saying the speaking in metaphor, but then saying like, oh, you still working on the translator. I like that sort of recurring joke with his character, that he still speaks in metaphor, but not always, so that you can kind of understand him, that they've fixed the universal translator enough based off of that episode Darmok that he can actually speak to people in Federation Standard, but he's not perfectly there yet. And I also like that the episode did just enough of explaining like that without beating over the head with it. So if you needed a reminder of how these people speak in metaphor, or hadn't seen the Darmok episode, that you can still watch this and get like, oh, these people speak in like weird metaphor. But it wasn't like, oh, it didn't like beat you over the head with that. There was that moment in the transporter room, there's sort of beating over where that sort of happened. But we get to the main plot of the episode, as I said in my spoiler-free section, where it's a collector ship. The crew's there to sort of help with dealing with cataloging of the collector stuff. Clearly, like I said, there is a ton of Easter eggs in this collector ship. I could sit here all day cataloging all of them, but I'll just name a few of the ones that were my personal favorite right here. I love seeing the Terran Empire Mirror Universe flag in the background. I liked that we saw the game, the little headset that gave everyone orgasms over on the Next Generation, in there as well. We also saw Picard's painting on the back wall, the painting that Picard painted way back in that one episode where he was like painting that naked woman. It was like, Data was like, oh, this is actually kind of horrible, but I'll try and be nice because Picard's the captain. That was on there as well. Also, my favorite one, but also one that kind of saddened me, was the giant skeleton that we see wearing the Starfleet TOS uniform, the blue one, which is clearly reference to the giant Spock from Star Trek the Animated Series, the one that like there was a Spock clone and he was like a giant one. It was the episode written by Walter Koenig. I forget the name of the episode, but it's a weird episode, but I always kind of liked the idea, and they referenced it in season 1. I like the idea that there was technically in Star Trek canon a giant Spock clone just floating around, but clearly here in the collector ship, this is it's not confirmed, but it's basically kind of referencing the fact that apparently that giant Spock clone died, and then his body just got hung up here in a kind of gruesome way. But it was a cool reference, but it was like, woo, That's kind of creepy and scary and weird. Very, very eldritch horror. It's got very horror vibes from that going on there. But the collector storyline keeps going, and we basically learn that the guy who asked them to sort of help them catalog this collector's stuff took Kaelus's fornication helmet, which is like I guess a Klingon condom, but a helmet. It was wonderful. I love that. And it set off a trap that sort of caused them to have to run through and try and get out of this collector's base, setting up a conflict between Mariner and Jet, with Mariner kind of being like, oh, I want to take the risk. I want to be the hero. I want to go save people. And Jet sort of setting up to be this guy who's like, no, we have to think of everyone else. We need to be the safe route. We don't need to be heroes. We need to get off the ship. And they sort of come into conflict in that way that felt very reminiscent of Boimler and Mariner back in season 1, where they were kind of fight between doing things the button-up Starfleet way and doing things the Mariner like heroic way. But as the episode goes on and they sort of are dealing with things, we start to realize that this dichotomy that we had in season 1 isn't exactly what's happening here. That it's not that Jet is buttoning up and trying to like do things the Starfleet code way. Instead, Jet isn't like doing things by the book. He's trying to make sure he sits and actually thinks things out instead of Mariner's way of like rushing through and trying to get things done immediately and quickly. And I sort of like that subtle shift in Mariner's character dynamic, because it's not framing Mariner as a renegade anymore, but starting to show like, oh, this is actually criticizing her as a actual commander. It's about her taking charge as a commander role and critiquing her how she is as a commander instead of someone who's trying to rebel outside of the command structure, and setting her up for what I think will be an arc for her character this season of her sort of taking on the role of being a good Starfleet officer and showing what it means to be a captain, to be a leader. And again, it's a small shift, but one I think is very elucidated in this dynamic that sort of brought forth between Jet being a slightly different version of Boimler here. So it's just critiquing her command style. Excellent stuff. And I liked that the resolution of this wasn't that either Jet or Mariner was completely right, but they had missed something. They weren't listening to their subordinates. They weren't listening to Rutherford and Tendi, who offered up a solution that actually got them out of there safer than either of them could have come up with. And I also love Tendi has this great moments like, the line, I need to look it up. It was a great line by Tendi, and they both went like, damn, stay alert, stay alive. Like, great line by Tendi. I loved it. But also what I loved is that this sort of discussion of command dynamics and what it means to be a commander was reflected over on the Cerritos with Captain Freeman, sort of having her command evaluation and her being criticized by Starfleet for being a micromanager and like being like, am I really a micromanager? And Ansem being like, oh, I don't want to say anything to that. I'm just going to stay out of that one criticism. But it sort of was reflecting the same idea of like what it means to be a good commander. And I like the fact that she sort of stays hands off, and that's what causes the away team to not have anyone check in on them and could have saved them earlier. Great little sequence there. Also, I forgot to mention Kayshon got turned into a puppet, which was also hilarious and just weird, but still felt very Star Trek, like very much felt like a Star Trekian thing that would happen, but also very lower decks as well at the same time. So great choice there. Also, another quick little thing. I loved that the counselor, played by Paul F. Tompkins, the sort of bird guy, was sitting in the third seat on the Cerritos, like showing that apparently the third seat in the command chair is for the counselor that we saw back in TNG with Troy. But it's always strange to me that the counselor gets the third chair on the bridge. But I mean, that's awesome. That shows that they care about mental health, which is great. So all of that was great over there on the Cerritos side of things, and I love the subtle shift in Mariner's dynamic going forward. But this brings us over to the Titan storyline this episode, with Boimler sort of being over on the Titan and kind of being in over his head, like being kind of scared, fighting everybody, not really enjoying that, kind of trying to read all the reports and staying up to date on everything. And what I was really worried about with what this storyline was setting up was that it was going to be setting up Boimler to be bad at his job, right? That it was going to be like Boimler doesn't really fit at the Titan, he's not good at what he does there, and because of that, he's going to do some big mistake and get demoted and get sent back to the Cerritos. And I was really worried that that was going to be the case, because I didn't want them to sort of get Boimler back to Cerritos, something that we kind of expect was going to happen, by having Boimler sort of regress and be bad at his job. Also, one quick little aside here, if you'll allow me to indulge my super Trekkie nerddom here, one thing that bothers me over on this Titan storyline is that apparently the Titan's first officer is not Christine Vale, who is a character from the Star Trek Titan novels, as well as appeared in the Star Trek Picard novel that recently came out just a few months ago, that is technically kind of pseudo-beta canon now, even though the Titan books technically aren't anymore because of what happened with Discovery. But anyways, Christine Vale is a great character. I loved her, and I'm really upset that she's not on the Titan here. What happened to that? Come on, bring me my Christine Vale. Make her canon. She's such a great character. Anyways, keep on going with this Titan storyline. The Titan crew goes down on a mining planet pretending to be miners and trying to like deal with the Packlids there. I like this sort of like action-y sort of idea of Starfleet. So we saw a few of things like this in different Star Trek stuff, like with people going undercover and things like that. And I love Boimler being called out because his hands are soft and everything. But I also like this sort of setup with the away team where they were all sort of saying like, yeah, we're like tough. The Enterprise, they always had string quartets and we're just like doing weird, dumb stuff. And they weren't like hardened warriors like we are. And as the storyline goes on, Boimler starts to realize that this isn't what he likes about Starfleet. And so when they get captured, or almost captured by the Pakleds, Boimler kind of stands up and says, no, this isn't what I like. What I like about Starfleet isn't the action stuff, the fighting stuff. It's the exploration. It's the seeking out new worlds and new civilizations, all of that stuff. Not this sort of action-oriented Starfleet things going on here. And the crew of the Titan on the away team reflects that. They're like, oh yeah, I kind of got into this to study Moss and explore things. And I really loved this because it felt very much like an interesting critique on certain episodes and directions of Star Trek. I know a lot of particular people will point to like Discovery or Picard for being much more action-oriented versions of Star Trek, but I don't think that this episode is like really hitting on that and saying like, oh, Discovery or Picard are bad or wrong in terms of how they represent Star Trek. But it's also like pointing at things like Deep Space Nine, because later on Boimler says, oh, it's like serialized storytelling that like made me question my reality, which is something that Deep Space Nine did and Discovery did as well. Also, some of the later Star Trek Next Generation movies and also the Kelvin timeline movies did this as well. Like First Contact, Nemesis were very much more action-oriented Star Trek movies. And so I appreciate this criticism of like the dark and gritty, more action-focused Star Trek. And it's not doing it at a detriment to that, saying like these things are bad. Clearly we have like, Jonathan Frakes Riker sort of evoking like, I like to do this Titan stuff. That very much is who he is. And we clearly like Riker, so the show's not hating on that stuff. But it's sort of saying like, no, but there's two sides of the versions of Star Trek can be. And not in a beat you over the head kind of way with like, look, it's these kind of things, but in a subtle sort of reference to that. And I really liked that criticism here. It felt very meta and also showed Boimler as a character too, and sort of saying like, no, he wants to be someone who explores strange new worlds. He doesn't want to be the action-oriented Starfleet guy. I just thought that was a really kind of meta, interesting critique that this episode was kind of going for. But then it gets to one of my favorite, most intriguing parts of the episode, because Boimler figures out through his referencing of the Enterprise missions that he can pull a Thomas Riker, do a transporter clone, and get everyone out of the situation they're in and get everyone on the Titan, which has the inadvertent effect of, by the way, the scene where Boimler's like screaming and the transport is like catching him every few seconds. That's hilarious. But it turns out Boimler has a transporter clone that gets created. And because of this, now we have two different Boimlers. One that's staying on the Titan and one that's going back to the Cerritos, which I loved. Because again, I was really worried that they were going to have Boimler be bad at his job. And that was the reason that he gets sent back to the Cerritos. But here, it's kind of having the best of both worlds, to use another Star Trekian phrase, because you have a Boimler who gets to stay on the Titan. We get to kind of see that journey for that character who kind of has this more action-oriented version of himself. But we also get our Boimler back on the Cerritos who kind of gets to be the one that we get to follow, the exploratory one. And so I like that it's not as bad as his job. It's just that, he kind of has to, split up because they don't want to have the same guy on the same ship, which would cause tons of, I'm sure, psychological issues and problems if Farscape is to anything to go by, and the fact that they didn't even bring it up ever again in Next Generation, which is kind of frustrating. I mean, I love Thomas Riker. I liked his appearance in Deep Space Nine. They should have brought him back. But two notes here, one positive and one negative. The positive one is I like that there's a subtle hint that the Boimler clone that stays on the Titan might have something off about him. Like, he might be a little bit more deceptive because he's not exactly a clone of Boimler, because the Boimler that goes back to the Cerritos is the one that steps forward, and the other clone is like, no, you take forward. And he's very quick to slip into being buddy-buddy with Riker, as we saw in those few moments. So there's this subtle hint that storyline may be going somewhere, and I love that. I love that there's consequences for this, and I'm really curious what the mystery behind this Boimler clone is going to end up being, whether that comes up in a few episodes or towards the end. But I trust the show to be able to pay that off in an intriguing way. So I like that there's consequences for this. It's not just like, oh, and Boimler had his little Titan excursion, but he's back on the Cerritos now. Like, no. There's a storyline going forward with this, and that is insanely cool. However, this does bring me to my negative of this, because it felt like while they were having those consequences, the show did kind of want to get Boimler back so we could have our normal sort of lower decks type adventures with Boimler back with the Cerritos crew. And in doing so, what they did is they sent him back to the Cerritos, which kind of makes sense. But they also lower him back to ensign, which I was confused by. It's like, he actually saved lives. Why would he be demoted to go back to the Cerritos? And I feel like the reason is kind of not in universe, but out of universe. Very much the writers kind of saying like, oh, we want Boimler to go back to the Cerritos, kind of be on the same level with everybody, kind of set up that dynamic that we had in season 1 with everyone sort of being ensigns and being lower deckers. When I find that kind of saddening, because I would have liked to see a little bit more consequences going forward for that. Like, would it have been interesting if Boimler goes back to the Cerritos, but is a lieutenant, technically does have more rank over Mariner, and yet Mariner is the one who has this arc about learning how to be a better commander this season. And so what would that mean for Mariner to have to learn to not only be a better commander, but also take orders from someone like Boimler? And so I'm a little bit disappointed that they sort of shunt him back down to ensign for no real reason other than it just seems like they want to sort of bring us back to that status quo. Maybe, again, I haven't seen future episodes, so I don't know if that's going to be the case going forward. I'll sort of give them that grace to maybe possibly prove me wrong, but that was just something I was a little bit saddened by. It was just sort of like trying to have its cake and eat it too. And part of that cake was interesting, but part of it just like kind of like, oh, you're kind of bringing me back to the status quo, which I was a little bit disappointed by overall. But again, I'm willing to trust that they'll bring something good out of it. So overall, I think this is a great episode. Again, showing great comedy, meta critique on Star Trek, some great references, and yet also doing it married with really great character arcs. This is why I love Lower Decks. It managed to be funny, meta commentary, and yet still strong with its characters and what it's saying with its characters. So excellent work this episode. Again, really lovely, but I'd love to hear all your thoughts on this episode of Star Trek Lower Decks. Did you love it? Did you hate it? Let me know all that down in the comments below. Don't forget, I have a Patreon page that you can help support me at. I also have a podcast called Drawn to Trek, where I also go into even further depths about Lower Decks and why I love it with a co-host, Geek Filter, who is also part of this wonderful community. But regardless of all of that stuff, thank you so much for being here. Don't forget to subscribe, and I hope that you, as always, live long and prosper.